I think I can speak to this most clearly at the moment because I'm just getting over a burnout from conventional play. When I first got into the hobby some 20 years ago at this point, the amount of pressure and expectation that was laid on the Dungeon Master's shoulders was minuscule in comparison to the amount that is expected today. Conventional play, in my opinion, has broken the scale of equality between the players and the Dungeon Masters. To get some definitions down so I'm clear, when I say conventional play, I mean modern play, right? The way people tend to play D&D and really most D20 tabletop role-playing games in the current era. I think anybody who is engaged with it knows what conventional D&D play looks like. The DM has done a large amount of prep work prior to the session, and then the players show up and kind of make decisions when prompted, while the Dungeon Master basically performs the show. Unfortunately, oftentimes, the decisions that players make are actually quite limited due to the fact that modern adventure design is incredibly hand-railed. You feel like you're deciding where you're walking, but you're actually limited by the rails on either side. Even when a Dungeon Master is running an adventure that is uniquely their creation, unfortunately, it tends to be the case that they are informed on how adventure design works either by product created by the company of the game that they're playing, or how their previous DMs tended to run games for them. A lot of what makes D&D special, in some ways, I guess, is the folklore aspect. So much so that I think the majority of modern Dungeon Masters don't actually read the books to learn how to run, but rather just kind of run as the person who ran for them did, and then they supplement their knowledge with people online giving advice, content creators, or wherever they can find it. However, this can and has caused issues when adventure and campaign design haven't done anything to change the mold in 40 years. So much of that hand-railed, no matter the player's choice, we still kind of end up at the desired location design remains. I mean, it's no wonder that in the community there's a trope of the quantum ogre. Whether you take path A or path B, you're running into an ogre because the Dungeon Master or adventurer decided that there must be an encounter then. Now, adventures and campaigns more closely resemble books to me, with these forced encounters, plots, and narratives rather than open situations that you can drop into your games and the players can kind of solve or interact with them in any way that they choose. Now, I don't know how this is for you, but for me this led to an incredible amount of creative burnout. Speaking from personal experience, when I first got into the hobby, things truly felt equal between the players and the Dungeon Master. There were expectations that if I wanted to get involved, I had to learn the rules and master them like everybody else at the table. I had to be prepared, and I had to truly commit to the game. Not only that, but I had to be a proactive player. Obviously, we were kids at the time, but it was taken quite seriously. I mean, I could have never gotten away with just showing up to play on game night and making decisions whenever the Dungeon Master prompted me for them. I and the other players at the table had to push the action ourselves. We even had a few friends who tried to join and play the first way, and ultimately they were removed from the group. Not from the larger friendship circle, to be clear. I mean, we're not fucking crazy, but when it came to playing D&D, I mean, they just weren't the right fit. That brings me back to the main point. The way we played back then would not be common today, and I think even for its time was different than the way that the modules and adventures would tell you how to play. So, if this is how I learned, then how did I get dragged into conventional play? Well, you see, I played when I was younger for quite a long time, and then as I got older, life kind of got in the way, right? Family, kids, education, all of that stuff. And I dropped out of the hobby for some time. This is not uncommon. A lot of people who have returned to the hobby basically have the same experience. And when I came back, the entire hobby felt like it had changed. Instead of a variety of games, everybody was playing one game, 5th edition Dungeons & Dragons. And what was expected from players in particular had changed. I didn't really need to know the rules or have any sort of mastery over them. And even character creation would be handled directly with the Dungeon Master, who would kind of hold my hand through the process. At the time, it was explained to me that the game was just much more casual now, with less focus on player mastery and more just about hanging out and rolling dice with some friends without taking it all too seriously. And that's fine. I guess if that's your preferred method of playing, then obviously this video isn't for you. But there is, in my opinion, a better and more compelling way to play. So, to get back a bit, fast forward about a year into the new campaign, and the Dungeon Master at the time calls it quits. He had burnt out from play and just really needed a break. Thinking nothing of it, I offered to take over and really set myself up. I mean, initially it was fun while I was learning the rules and kind of gaining a system mastery, and I didn't really pay no mind to the amount of work that had been shifted onto my shoulders, but over time it really started to creep in. I mean, realizing that to prep for each session appropriately was taking up a significant portion of my time, and the more I ran, the more I realized that this was an insane amount of the creative burden to carry. like I'm an author writing a book or some shit. And even when I looked up like how to cut down prep time, it seemed directly at odds with other advice that same person would give to create a more engaging game. So on one hand, I can ease the burden on myself at the detriment of the game, or I stick to the game style and find myself burned out creatively without any passion to run the game anymore. So what's the balance? Well, I did what all 5th edition DMs tend to do, right? I started to break the rules. I started to impose all sorts of changes to the system, level caps, restricting resurrection spells, death at 0 HP with no death saves, right? The whole deal. And while those things did help, and while I was able to cut down my prep time significantly, I still found myself struggling with player engagement. The expectation to these players was to show up on game day and play what gets prompted to them. Almost without even trying, games took on this feeling of being on a railroad when that was the last thing that I wanted to play or run. It just didn't seem like the players wanted anything else. They wanted to show up, they wanted to play their character, and they wanted me to tell them the story of their character, while giving the occasional kind of fork in the road that developed who their character was. To them, providing me a backstory and playing was their end of the work for the campaign. This also isn't an unfortunate player lineup situation. I mean, at this point, I've run for well over 100 players, and I'd say that a clear majority of them had this approach to the game. Now, I don't think these people were selfish, right? I think they're just playing the way that modern D&D teaches them to play, and they don't know any better. There's a lot of factors into why things have changed this way. Why the Dungeon Master is expected to shoulder all of the campaign's story with pre-written plots and adventures while making the most out of the player's backstory and incorporating it all into some grand narrative. Whether it's because of the corporatization of the hobby and changing D&D into a lifestyle brand, or the knock-on effect of modern media, video games, and actual plays that demonstrate a form of play that is far removed from the rules of the game, the biggest reason I think for me, and this may be tied up into the other reasons as well, but modern campaign and adventure design have failed both players and dungeon masters. It's created this culture where the vast majority of the campaign work comes from a single person instead of a shared game experience. The expectations because of these modules is that a single person should facilitate a completely kind of custom movie-like experience. They've removed agency from the players by creating adventures that are meant to be played through like books or movies, with plot points that can't be skipped or missed. This forces the Dungeon Master to override or not allow unique and creative moments from the players because that doesn't happen in the story yet, rather than that's not allowed by the rules, right? When I was younger, the entirety of the game came from us, not the Dungeon Master's prepared story, but the Dungeon Master's reactive play to our proactive play. It felt equal, right? It felt like we had a huge say in how the world and the story of our campaign went, and it wasn't just us responding to the prompts that the Dungeon Master placed in front of us. We chose our own path, and the Dungeon Master responded. Through our own decisions, we succeeded or we failed. We created the big bads. It wasn't some character that was planned by the Dungeon Master to be the main villain from the beginning, right? Our choices created our rivals, it created our allies, and it created the narratives and stories that logically and naturally sprung from our decision making. All of this led to a much higher player engagement with much less burnout and greater campaigns that maintained a sense of continuity that most modern campaigns just do not have. Even if you make it to the end, these days with adventure modules, it feels like the threat is so powerful that once you finally defeat it, how can you ever top it, right? How do you continue the game? I've spoken to game masters of all types across all kinds of games, and it is interesting to me that for the vast majority of them, their burnout comes from 5th edition Dungeons & Dragons, and they all cite the same things: the system and the players. I also think that there are a lot of dungeon masters out there who would prefer a different way of playing, but don't really know that it's possible, because this is all they and their players have ever known. They think that the only way to play is to build this reactive framework where the players are never truly proactive except in the few moments you give them to decide if they take path A or path B, and even that choice, as we saw earlier with the Quantum Ogre, is getting taken away from them. There's also probably a ton of players out there that feel the same way and want to be more proactive in their games, but are never really given the opportunity due to modern adventure and campaign design. They're all stuck in the mud with this one campaign style because it's the only way that the majority of tables have been playing for the past, 30 or 40 years, and you rarely get introduced to the other ways unless you're lucky or you see the potential of tabletop games and try to seek out others that do as well. DMing has changed, and in my opinion, it has changed for the worse. If you are spending the majority of your time preparing to give your players choices to make, then I think you're doing it wrong, right? If you are preparing a campaign and have the big bad and the total story arc for the campaign plotted out that the players have to experience, then I think you're doing it wrong, and you're doing a disservice to yourself and the players. To sum things up, a lot of what I'm talking about comes with a fundamental change to the way that you as the Dungeon Master and your players approach the game. It is asking more from your players and less from yourself, but in a good way, right? While 5th edition may have its bulk of issues, I don't believe it's the system that is burning people out, rather the style of play. Campaigns these days ask so much of the creative effort from the Dungeon Master and very little from the player, and switching things up is going to rightfully shift some of that creative burden to all players at the table equally. It's not easy, and some players are probably just going to not want to do it, right? It's hard to break your players out of the habit of waiting to be prompted for a choice to make. It's comfortable to just sit back and wait for the Dungeon Master to give you a choice. It's also difficult for a lot of Dungeon Masters to break out of this pattern as well. I mean, there is something enjoyable about the ego stroking you get when you plan a great story, right? And the players love every moment of it, to have kind of full creative control over the world. But in my opinion, the God Complex is not one that is easy to break. However, in the long run, it will lead to more fulfilling campaigns. So that's mostly it. As a Dungeon Master, if you're looking to avoid burnout, try removing yourself from the current style of play. Try to let go of the wheel and allow your players to drive the action forward. You don't need to have some grand narrative prepared to get a game going, right? You just need a few rumors, maybe some jobs, and most importantly, you need players that are running characters that have personal ambitions. Say for instance that a player wants to become a lord, right? To do so, they need to be powerful and they need gold. Well, the only way to get gold is to take on jobs or go dungeon delving, and by consequence of chasing their personal ambitions, they will earn enemies and allies. Those enemies become the big bads, right? They become the grand narrative of the campaign organically. Allow your players to naturally come to the conclusion. You want to do X, but X requires Y, and Y is located at Z. So what do you want to do? This is just a start of what will likely be a series of videos where I expand on the ways that you can introduce this style of play at your table and just general Dungeon Master advice. It's easy to say, just go back and read the old books, but most people aren't really going to do that. So hopefully this format is easy to understand and at the very least, spurs the type of creative thinking that leads to better campaign play. Next time, we'll be talking about one-to-one time or Jeffro-Gaxian timekeeping and how it can drastically improve your campaigns and your world setting. So, if you enjoyed the content, please feel free to tell me about your experience in the comments. I'm always looking for different perspectives, especially on topics like these. Like and subscribe, as well as consider joining my community Discord for a chance to play in a future game with me. The link will be in the description below. Thanks.